We pick up in Habakkuk chapter 3 tonight, and we will explore what influenced Habakkuk's mind in this section. A prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, on Shigionoth. Lord, I have heard your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. I'm reading from the NIV, pardon me. Renew them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand, where his power was hidden. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. The ancient mountains crumbled, and the age-old hills collapsed. His ways are eternal. I saw the tents of Cushan in distress, the dwellings of Midian in anguish. Were you angry with the rivers, O Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode with your horses and your victorious chariots? You uncovered your bow. You called for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. Torrents of water swept by. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear. In wrath you strode through the earth, and in anger you threshed the nations. You came to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. You crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. With his own spear, you pierced his head. With his warriors, when his warriors stormed out to scatter us, gloating as though about to devour the wretched who were in hiding. You trampled the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. I heard and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones and my legs trembled. Tonight we're going to ponder for a moment what Habakkuk came to grips with here, because what you see in this section is the glory, majesty, and authority of God. And this is with reference to the past. The glory, majesty, and authority of God in the past. Please note how this section begins. A prayer of Habakkuk the prophet on Shigionoth. Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. In these first two verses, the prophet Habakkuk asked God to go ahead, if he might, and judge and punish his people, but preserve them. Preserve us. He said, I stand in awe of your deeds. Renew them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Now, please underline both terms, wrath and mercy. Because here the prophet Habakkuk is saying, God, judge us if you must, but remember mercy. Revive us as in the days of old. Bring us back to what we were in better times in terms of our walk with you. Renew your deeds in us in our day. He's still concerned about his times. And in our time, make them known. So this man, although this chapter really is very, very, well, it's filled with a lot of emotions, because the prophet is looking at God's majesty and his authority, his glory, and his power in the past, in his past dealings with Israel. And so he prayed for the nation and for the nation's both punishment and preservation. Please remember that he cries out for revival. Although he believed that justice, retributive justice, must be done, he prayed for preservation, verses 1 and 2. And then you will notice that from verse 3, he discusses God's person. He talks a bit about God's person, the majesty of his person. And reference is made here in verses 3 and 4 to the Shekinah. Reference is made to the glory of God, God's glory and excellence and brightness. And he presents it here, what he saw. He said it was as the rays of light from the sun at sunrise. That is how he's describing what he saw in this vision. His glory covered the heavens, verse 3b, and his praise filled the earth. His splendor was like the sunrise. The sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand, where his power was hidden. So here we get a sense of the brightness and the excellence of God's presence. A kind of reference to his Shekinah. Hallelujah. A kind of reference to his glory. And Habakkuk is amazed at this. But then he moves on from that picture to one that describes his power. His power. Plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. So the prophet here is looking at the power of God that was manifested through plagues and pestilences and diseases, both with reference to the punishment of those who disobeyed God, as well as those who opposed him. You know, there was the matter of plagues and pestilence that was used as judgment on Egypt. But please remember too that in the book of Numbers, God sent plagues and pestilence as an act of judgment when his people disobeyed him. Numbers 11, 14 and 16 brings this out. You recall the many times Israel reacted against God, displeased him, and his power was manifested with plague and pestilence. And then he proceeds to show, and please understand that the rest of this section from verse 5 right through to the section where I ended my reading, you will notice that it covers periods of Israel's history and how God acted with a display of his power. He stood and shook the earth. He looked and made the nations tremble. Verse 6. The ancient mountains crumbled. The age-old hills collapsed. All of these are descriptions of God's active power in the world. He displayed his power with reference to the judgment against disobedience, against the judgment of pagan nations, and as a display of his own majesty. His ways are eternal, the prophet said at the end of verse 6. And then in verse 7, he said, I saw the tents of Cushan in distress. Now, Cushan is Arabia. And he makes reference to Cushan here, and you will notice Midian. Now, please understand that God's display of his presence and power at Sinai from Exodus 19, where God sealed that covenant and declared this covenant with Israel, was a very strange and frightening display of God's majestic power. If you read the early verses of Exodus 19, the Israelites were so afraid as God displayed his power and as God prepared to give the law to Israel. But we must understand that the reference to Cushan and Midian are references to his power displayed to the lands that were near to Sinai, where God first showed his glory to Israel and gave them the commandments. Now, please understand that if you look at history, biblical history, and you look at even the reaction of the people in the time of the invasion of Jericho, that they had already known. The woman who the spies met, Rahab, she had already heard what God did for Israel in delivering the nation. So the nearby nations, the surrounding nations in the entire Mesopotamian area knew that Israel's God had intervened on Israel's behalf, and they feared. They feared. The reference to Teman in verse 3, when it said God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Now, Teman refers to Edom or Idumea. And Paran refers to the territory between Sinai and as it were, between Sinai and Edom. So those persons between Edom or Idumea and the territory I just mentioned, Edom, they realized and they experienced and they saw and they felt the impact of Israel's deliverance. Please remember that Edom historically hated Israel. Please remember they did not wish to give Israel a passageway on their way outside, away from Egypt. They reacted against Israel and would not allow them passage. And God had that against Edom. And we have to understand When God is in covenant with a people, he will not only protect them, but he will fight against and he will judge their enemies. Now, Edom, the Edomites were descendants of Esau, and they were constant enemies of Israel. Constant enemies. In fact, one of the well-known leaders in the New Testament was an Idumean, and he, one of the Herods, and he himself was responsible for and had intention to act against the gospel, to act against the Christ, the Messiah. He was a descendant of Esau. So God came from Teman does not, and I remember some years ago, I think it was a Rastafarian gentleman who thought that God came from Teman meant it was giving a geographical location for where God lives. And he wanted to build a story, or a sort of pro-African story out of that, without understanding that Teman was geographically and historically Edom, the land of Edom, and the nation of the Edomites, that vicinity. And it was not indicating anything about a physical dwelling place of God. It's just sad sometimes how people take scriptures and make a wreck of it. And sometimes this is because of their misreading of the King James Version in particular. God came from Teman. The casual reader who has no knowledge of scripture thinks that he's getting some kind of geographical direction of God's hometown, which is really not so. It's far from anything like that. So what you have here is a progressive development of God's activities from Sinai, historically, where God gave Israel the law, right through dealing with all the various nations that acted against Israel, right through until their possession of the promised land. And this was to help Habakkuk recognize that God's sovereign power, that God's majesty should create awe, should create wonder, and should evoke worship. So he talks about the Shekinah in verse 4. He talks about the movement of God's power and his work and his activities from Sinai through to Edom and through all the Arabian territories. And later on, you will see that reference is made of Egypt. Okay, so he says God's ways are eternal, verse 6. Then he mentioned the tents in Cushan, and he said they are in distress, and the dwellings of Midian is in anguish. So he mentions again, he makes a national reference. Cushan is Arabia. Cush refers to the Arab nations. He said their tents, and by the way, there were dwellers in tents. He said they were distressed at the awe of God's judgment and power. Cushan and Midian. And then here we have statements made now about the clash with the Egyptian army. Were you angry with the rivers, O Lord? Was your wrath against the streams? Did you rage against the sea when you rode with your horses and your victorious chariots? You uncovered your bow. You called for many arrows. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. Torrents of water swept by. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high. Reference, no doubt, to God's majestic power displayed at the Red Sea. And how God sovereignly and supernaturally led his people through very, very trying times, challenges. So we see God's power over the plagues and pestilences, God's power over the earth in verse 16, God's power over Cushan and Media, verse 7, God's power over rivers and seas, verse 8, God's power to divide the earth, verse 9, God's power over rains and floods, verse 10. And then we have now here clearly a reference case to the situation with Joshua when he decided in one of his major battles and was confronted with issues of the need for clarity, for vision. Sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear. Now, those of you who have read the account in Joshua, when Joshua needed something supernatural to happen in the heavenly bodies for a battle he had to fight. And he made a declaration and he gave a command to the heavenly bodies. The reference is hinted at here. God's power over the heavenly bodies in verse 11. The sun and moon stood still in the heavens at the glint of your flying arrows, at the lightning of your flashing spear. And so Joshua won that battle. In wrath, you strode through the earth, and in anger, you threshed the nations. So God is presented here as a conqueror, marching through and conquering in verse 12. And then the issue here now has to do with the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. He said, you came out to deliver your people, to save your anointed one. When he makes reference, when his people, his covenant people who are separated to him and consecrated to him are designated the anointed. And sometimes it is a reference long-term to the Messiah. So you have here God working through all sorts of events and situations, showing his control over nature through the heavenly bodies, through rivers and waters and floods, through his majestic power in order to deliver his people. Verse 13, you crushed the leader of the land of wickedness. You stripped him from head to foot. With your own spear, you pierced his head when his warriors stormed out to scatter us. So, pictures of God's power against the enemies of Israel. And what is interesting is that you have a picture of the prophet being presented with Israel's enemies being defeated, delivering Israel from the Chaldeans, and then at the same time, the Chaldeans being turned against the Chaldeans, their own people. You remember the case in 2 Chronicles 20 of a different battle though, when you had this Moab Ammonite invasion of Israel. And when God intervened supernaturally without one sword being lifted, God supernaturally turned this coalition of three nations, turned them against each other, and they started destroying each other. Well, that's the picture there in verse 14. So we see a rough sketch of the history of God's acts of deliverance of his own people. Now we also see God's power to agitate the sea. Look at verse 15. You trample the sea with your horses, churning the great waters. God's power to agitate the sea. So what we see is his person, presented with pictures and references of his Shekinah. And we also see the magnificent display of his power from verse 5 to 15 through various phases in Israel's national life and in Israel's historic experiences. Now, I want you to note verse 16. I heard, he said, and my heart pounded, and my lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones. He's being very personal here because he's telling you now the impact of what he saw, the impact of this vision. And my legs trembled. Now I want you to see similar effects on another prophet when God showed him what was coming. Turn with me to Daniel chapter 8. And after God revealed to Daniel in his vision of the ram and a goat and what that was symbolic of, we're told here in Daniel 8, verses 17 and 18. Well, let's look at 15. When I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there stood before me one that looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. And as he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. Now, Daniel is being shown issues connected with the times of the end, future to his time, and his body could not handle the impact of that vision. Verse 18, while he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. Glance down at verse 27 of the same Daniel 8. Then Daniel was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond my understanding. Brothers and sisters, the impact of the vision regarding the future on Daniel. Now let us look at another section of Daniel to see a similar impact. Daniel chapter 9. And I'm going to read verses 7 to 10. I, Daniel, was the only one who saw the vision. The men with me did not see it. But such terror overwhelmed them that they fled and hid themselves. So I was left alone, gazing at this great vision. I had no strength left. My face turned deathly pale, and I was helpless. Then I heard him speaking. As I listened to him, I fell into a deep sleep. So he fell into a trance here, my face to the ground. Verse 10, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. So the impact.
Pastor, you said Daniel chapter 9?
The second reference I gave was chapter 9, yes, 10. 10 verses 7 to 10. Sorry.
Okay.
The first one is Daniel 7. Okay, so the impact. So you notice a similar impact on Habakkuk when he saw this vision of God's majesty and power, and that serious days were ahead, frightening days, because God was going to intervene, and the impact of it would be felt by both his nation as well as the Chaldeans. Okay, now how this issue of God's glory and majesty and authority, how should this impact us in the challenging times in which we live? How should this impact us and this matter of God's timing, God's ways, God's glory, God's authority, and God's power? I'd like to suggest 3 ways in which it should impact us. First of all, our focus should be on God's majestic power. And we should not be fixated on the problems of this estranged world. Secondly, it should lead to a deeper and greater commitment to the promises and purposes of God for the present and the future. It should lead to a deeper and a greater commitment to our study of the promises and purposes of God for the present and the future. And thirdly, it should motivate prayer. It should motivate us to prayer and Christian service. And by that I mean Christian ministry. Those are 3 ways I'd like to suggest that it should impact us as we deal with the concerns Habakkuk had for his times, in parallel with the concerns we have about our times.